Welcome back to Telendor Gaming. Hope everyone's doing well. So this episode's literally just gonna be a little bit of the timeline of Resident Evil 6. I'm gonna give my overarching thoughts on just the game as a whole. And this would be the conclusion of Resident Evil 6, and we dive right into Resident Evil 7 in the next episode. Just a heads up, like I said at the end of the previous episode, I did start the first episode or two of Resident Evil 7 with the concept thought of I wasn't playing 5 or 6 yet because I still had to get them, and then I went ahead and bought them after I recorded the first episode or two. So, mind you, I only recorded 2 episodes, I didn't record the whole game. So, after this, um, I will make a note when I'm like, I just resumed Resident Evil 7 from where I left off, and that way you know where I'm currently at. But let's go ahead and do this timeline real quick, shall we? So in the very beginning, December 24th, 25th, 2012, in the game, Eastern Europe is when Chris and Pierce met. Remember, met in a bar? And during that time, he also had another situation go on, and that would happen to be, if you remember right, when Chris and Pierce met and they did that little, they went through like the bridge area and they went to Times Square. That happened in Eastern Europe. At the same time, that's when Sherry met Jake. So you see the cutscenes where Sherry tells Jake her mission, which is to bring him to her contact to make sure his blood could be used to heal people who have the C virus. And then we ran into Ushtanak the Tracker, which when we played Jake, Ushtanak showed up in literally every chapter, it felt like, and just would not die and constantly hunted Jake down. Then, towards the end of that, is when Chris and Pierce, as you see in this scene, met Sherry and Jake. This was their first introduction. Not necessarily as much, well, I guess yeah, because this is where Chris says to Sherry, "You're Sherry Buckins." And Sherry's like, "Yes, do I know you?" And Chris is like, my sister Claire from Resident Evil 2, back when they were in Raccoon City, said a lot about you. So this is when they first met, and Pierce was there, and so was Jake. And Urban Warfare, seizing the city. So this is the next scene right after that. And then it was after this. So this right here, right, is right after you fight both of the giant BOWs, where you have to shoot the thing that's like an antenna in the back of their neck. So that's what's happening during this time. So that just ended. They're about to go to separate ways. Like I said, this whole episode is just me going through the cutscenes and explaining the timeline. So you don't have to stay unless you want to, but I'm more than willing to, I'm just gonna give you as much detail as I can. Um, I don't think it would do this game a service if I didn't do this episode, only because a lot happened amongst 4 campaigns, and it's good to know where everyone stood. Leon and Ada had nothing to do with the beginning chapter of Jake and Chris. Enter Ada Wong, right? So at the time, we didn't know this was Carla Simmons. And at that same time, Sherry and Jake were on that helicopter, trying to take off from the city. It was after Chris and Pierce met Ada Wong in Town Hall, middle of that town, and was trying to flee, that Chris's new team got stuck in a room that shut on both sides, and then at the time we thought was Ada, came back and left a parting gift, which infected all of Chris's teams with the C virus. This is what initially made Chris want to hunt down Ada Wong in Chapter 3 for Chris. Right after this event occurred, during the same day, the plane that Sherry and Jake was on crashed because the Ushtanak was chasing after them and crashed the plane. Managed to wear a parachute, but something tore the parachute and it kind of plummeted to the snowfield. Um, Sherry's unique ability is when Jake pulls the blade out of Sherry's back and she insta heals. And one of his best lines during that was, "Maybe it's your blood that should have been tested." Which then Sherry claims that they did test her endlessly and it mutated. The mountain retreat was when they're in the cabin and they go into more detail about that. And then it's always something. So this is after they left this is right after they had left the caves chasing the Ushtanak and they used the drill to try and kill him. And then they go to leave the cave and they run into, at the time they think, Ada. Going forward, whenever it's not Ada, I'm just gonna say Carla, but this was their knowledge at the time. So when they ran into Carla, Sherry got knocked out by Ushtanak, who came up behind him, and Jake got knocked out as well, and that would be the end of that time frame. So all of this happened between Chris Pierce and Jake and Sherry December 24th, December 25th, 2012, right? Then we jump ahead to June 27th, 2013, and we introduce Ada. So, the submarine. Remember when she lands in the submarine and she comes out of the suit and then she's about to take action? So during that part, right, this was December 24th. This was June 27th. This was 6 months after what happened, which is actually named in the very first thing you can see. Eastern Europe, 6 months ago. So really, a lot of what's happening now is in the June-July area of 2013 in the timeline. This is when Ada sees the video saying that she got her order 6 months ago, and she's like, first time hearing about it. Mind you, it's saying she got ordered 6 months ago. And so she's leaving the submarine that she just went in to try and find out stuff about Simmons. And she's gonna go and figure out exactly what's happening by going to the laboratory. Then, June 29th, 2 days later, that's when Leon gets introduced into the story. So we already have Chris and Jake as referenced in the storyline, and then we also, I'm leaving the background hum just so that it's not just dead air, so you hear like Resident Evil soundtrack in the background. That's intentional. And Ada, we know what Ada is like trying to do next. Now, the very beginning of Leon's story, which is when he ends up shooting the president who got infected with the C virus. They found a survivor inside the university that they were at when they ran into the president. And then after we went and saved Liz, which was this survivor's daughter, she actually must have gotten bit or something, because during a elevator ride, she turned and ate her father. Then as they were fleeing, they were watching a video and they saw that survivors needed help, and Leon was going to go help him, and Helena's like, it's too late. Which it was, because by the time he turned back around, they were already being attacked, and there was not much that could be done. And then we went from, that's how this next one is when they went from the university. They found a path to go underground. And they went ahead and went under into the sewer area. Mind you, the very next thing, right? So that's when they went into the sewer area. Then, that same day, even though that's the last scene they had, a lot else happened in that chapter. They managed to go through the town. They managed to go and find survivors. They managed to go up to the kendo shop, and they managed to get onto a bus and escape the city. That was actually the end of the first chapter. Then, in the beginning of chapter 2, that's where this takes place. So most of the times, skips is usually the end of that current chapter. but I'm just gonna go into breakdown as we go. So, bus escape. This is technically how the beginning. It's either the beginning or the end of chapter 1, because the tragic accident. You know what? This might be the end of chapter 1. This might be the beginning of chapter 2. I don't know without watching it. We're not gonna watch all the cutscenes and stuff. You guys who've already seen it already saw it. I could have easily done that, but then I feel like that's overkill. Um, so after they had escaped the town, they had quote unquote crashed and they were teetering on the side of a cliff. The remaining survivors all got eaten by zombies, and they ended up crashing outside of a cemetery at Tall Oaks. They went to Tall Oaks Cathedral. This is where they had to go up, they had to shoot 5 bells, and they had to get statues, and this is how they opened the path leading down into where, I forgot what it's called in churches. The thing where the speaker, sits there and usually speaks to their audience. But the doorway, the hidden doorway that leads down into a basement-like area opened up and a spitter came out. Now, we finally figured out how normal people are getting infected. Because they're like, why are people becoming zombies all of a sudden? And then we heard in the university, and I forgot to mention this, that there was a mist that would cover the area, and this led to people getting infected who breathed it in, from whence how it came. There's the spitter, as you can see in that little image on the left there. That is the thing that will shoot mist out, and whoever breathes it in kind of turns into a zombie. And then we saw Ada's birth. This is when Leon and Helena saw a video down in the lab of Ada coming out of one of those cocoons, and it probably confused a lot. It definitely confused a lot for Leon. Helena didn't really know who she was. Soror's reunion. So this is when Helena ran into her sister Deborah, carried her. This is when we got into that little platform where Deborah was, turned solidified. And one sec, I'm having lag issues. At that same time, Ada's there watching Deborah transform as well. Fearsome foe. This is when Deborah becomes the thing and they stop fighting in the area below. So, just a heads up, the game itself does a... What is that noise? No. Stop. Sorry. Cat found something to play with. Shouldn't be playing with it. So, not to throw anyone off. The reason why that said 6 months ago as a cutscene is because of what happened next. So, this was right here. This was when Leon, Helena, and Ada fought Deborah. Ada and Leon saved Helena from Deborah. Deborah fell to her death after Helena tried to save her and said no more tears. They went to the laboratory. Ada found out about who Simmons really is, which he finds out right here, being like, Simmons is not this sloppy. Ada Wong knowing that who that person was, but this is before she blew up the laboratory. Like, this is, Ada, well, Carla. Ada finds out it's not Simmons that's been talking to her for the last 2 chapters, but it's actually Carla. During the same time, on June 29th, this is when Chris first meets Pierce. So, remember in December when I said that was 6 months ago? And then we saw Jake and Sherry and stuff like that? So, this is why they had that labeled as 6 months ago. Because this is actually the very beginning of chapter 1. This is the opening scene where Pierce finds Chris in a bar and convinces them to come back, and it happened during the same time as Ada, Leon, and Helena entering the laboratory. Um, and this is when Simmons mentions to Leon, you know, they overhear and they're like, Leon, they're like, Simmons, do you trust Simmons and all that? And then this is the end. This is when they nuked the area for Tall Oaks and they have to go to China. So, as you can tell, a trip to China for Ada after blowing up the laboratory. Chris going to China, with a new crew, because in Pierce's defense, what happened previously caused it. So Pierce was with Chris when everything happened, and they lost all the men, and Pierce ended up saving Chris. That was 6 months ago. Everyone else died, and he can't forgive himself for what happened. And that was the point of the flashback, to show you what happened. Then we go into June 30th. Now, think about it like this, right? 6 months ago for Chris, when he met Jake and Sherry with his team, China. 6 months later, Jake and Sherry have been kidnapped by Carla, and they were being experimented on at a research facility. Now, during the same time, if you look here, mutation for Chris, when they started transforming into other creatures, was the same time that Sherry had her great escape from the research facility. And then, Cocoons with Chris was at the same time, 6 months reunion, that Sherry and Jake ran into each other after both escaping from their respective places. The computer room where they saw the experiments being done on them and what was going on with Jake and his blood. And then Speeding Bike as they are escaping the research facility in Chapter 3 of Jake. And at the same time, Cried Anger. This is where the end of Chapter 1. This is what throws me off. I think this is where Chapter 1 goes, and he's like pissed off and stuff because he's lost his people. And then we went into Battle in Tussawan. So this is Chapter 3. That might have been the beginning of Chapter 3, end of Chapter 1, or Chapter 2. Battle in Tussawan. This is where Jake Mueller, Sherry Bacon, Pierce, and Chris all ran into each other in the square. This is when those guys were mutating into the Grasshopper guys, and they had a helicopter they had to take down together. As you can see from Chopper Attack, Cocoon in the cockpit, and Chopper Attack. So while Chris and Pierce... let me just keep the main characters to make this easier. While Chris and Jake were fighting in that square, was at the same time that Leon and Helena were on the plane dealing with the Spitter. And then shortly after that was when they crashed the plane into China. Now, Raccoon City reunion, right? So, while Chris was dealing with the Snake BOW, at that same time was when Jake and Leon ran into each other, and they ended up fighting the Ushtanok together. That conclusion of that fight is when a tower fell down and separated the parties back, going down separate paths again. During that time, Chris was still going through the BOW, trying to fight and kill off the snake that one by one was taking out his new comrades, and Ada ran into Chainsaw Guy. All this happened relatively the same time. So you have two people who were just running from the Ushtanak or just finished a fight. One person was fighting a snake, BOW, and one person fighting a chainsaw. Probably one of the few times you see events for everybody at the same time. It will happen once or twice more. Ada's cruelty, which is from Chris, which again, this is when she's sitting in the window and she injects Marco with it and he becomes the bug guy. And then right after that, he grabs Marco's C4 and puts it to a wall and then goes to chase after. And this is when Pierce tries to stop him and says, "Get hold of yourself. We could have avoided some of those deaths," which Chris doesn't want to acknowledge. Then as we're chasing down Ada, which is Carla at the time with Leon, and Chris as well, this is when they went through the facility. They had to race to the elevator. They had to do the separate room shooting the drone, so they went to the other side, and whoever, got through the locks first technically won the race, kind of thing. And then this is when Leon first Chris. This is when Chris and Leon meet. This is depending on who you're playing as. This is either chapter 4 or chapter 3, because Chris is about to go onto the boat, which is chapter 4. It's after this scene that we see Chris see. Keep in mind, some of the cutscenes that are not listed do happen, like the scene where Chris acknowledges to Pierce that yes, he was running from his past and thank you for being there for me. It's not considered a cutscene, but it's a very important scene for Chris and Pierce's story. And so it's from this part that Leon's like, "You chase after Ada, I trust you," and Chris is like, "You take care of Simmons." And then we go their separate ways again. And then June 30th, which is still the same day, a lot happened during this time. So this is when Jake is running through the boat with Chainsaw Guy, and this is when Ada decides to help from afar as a sniper. Then after that, when they go to get to the end of the boat section, Ada ends up shooting. First shoots beams to crash it onto the Chainsaw Guy. I keep calling Chainsaw Guy just because it's easier to say than is Ubizvo. Anyway, Chainsaw Guy. Then they ended up with Chainsaw Guy and Sherry on a boat going towards helicopter blades. Ada swings in, picks up Sherry, and Chainsaw Guy actually dies to helicopter blades. Then this is when Leon and Jake run into Simmons, and they realize, okay, Simmons, are you really, in league with the terrorists? And he admits to it. And then they go their separate ways, with Leon and Helena trying to deal with Simmons, who gets infected at this time by getting shot by Carla. And Jake, Sherry will go to run away, and they get abducted again. Final showdown with Derek Simmons, Leon. This is when Chris sees Carla on a boat, and Carla gets shot by Simmons' lackey, and then Carla says, "Well played," and falls off the boat and lands and makes a blood splat, so we think Carla is dead. And this is when Ada finds the goal of Simmons, which was to make Ada make someone else into Ada because of his obsession with Ada. And this is during the boat ride. This is the train ride that Helena and Leon go on with Simmons, and you see the big train fight. Then at the end of chapter 4, when they crash the train into off the bridge into the river and they come up on the side, for Leon, this is like the beginning of the last chapter, where he's like, okay, we need someone to go after Jake and them, and then he goes and says patch me in the BSAA, and this is when Chris and Leon talk over the radio, and Chris's favorite, one of his famous lines from this game, it's like, where are you, Leon? Leon's like, I'm in the middle of, I think they say Tai Chi or something to that effect, China, and Chris is like, get the hell out of there, and then this is when a nuke gets fired from the ship that Carla was on, that Pierce and Chris tried to stop, but it still managed to make its way to China. And at that same time, when that missile was launched, this is when Ada ran into Carla. Leon, Chris's conversation. This is, I just went over what that was. And this is when Ada's leaving that boat on an airship, on a helicopter. July 1st, the next day. Life or death, the longest elevator. So, this is when they're going through the town and it's just that mist is hitting everyone and turning everyone into a zombie. And this is when Chris and Pierce are going down the elevator because Leon made Chris promise that they would go help Jake. And this is when Chris says he's going to be giving up the BSAA after this and wants Pierce to take over in his place. Then we go into Zombie Wasteland as they keep going through. And this is also the prologue. This is where Ada, in the helicopter that you don't know in the very beginning, is saving Leon and Helena, who are getting mobbed by zombies. Remote rescue. This is when Chris undoes the locks containing Jake and Sherry so they're able to get out of their bindings. This is Sherry worried about what's going to happen to them. And this is Ada coming to rescue them, as stated. After that, Helena's hurt at this point. Leon comes and heals her, and this is when they're about to actually go and confront for the last time. Ingrid Hunnigan then calls in to help us. Blood ties from Chris, and this is where Chris and Jake run into each other, and Chris is like, I killed your father. You are Albert Wesker's son. And Jake is threatening Chris, but then doesn't shoot him because he understands it's bigger than the two of them. Time for a new pilot, which is during the... Not the plane thing. When does this take place? I know the cocoon hatches because this is right after their scene at the base where they're like, I killed your father, and then they get to the top and the cocoon hatches, and this is when Jake and Sherry go on their own and they fight Ushtanak, and Pierce and Chris fight the BOW. It's only going to get worse. This is when they're running away and the plane crashes and they have to run away from the plane and they get to the building. This is when they go in and they see Simmons standing there with blood like draining off of him because he's like decomposing. And at that same time, destruction of the underwater facility. This is when the underwater facility starts getting destroyed and they have to run away from the BOW. Simmons ending cutscene where he's about to fight. Same thing. To the roof. Sudden stop because someone needs a rescue. This is when Ada is shooting Simmons as he's climbing up after them as they're climbing up the cables in the elevator shaft, and you just gotta keep shooting them to go down. The ties that bind. This is Ada saying goodbye to Leon right after Simmons is defeated and dropped onto a burning platform. This is Ada saying, I'll see you around, and that's her leaving. And then the final battle. So this is the final battle of Leon and Helena versus Simmons. This is the close call. This is where Pierce injects himself with the C virus to save Chris, and then they fight the BOW. Ishtanak immolated. This is when Ishtanak shows up and they fight in the volcanic area on all those different catwalks with Jake and Sherry. And this is Ada's smile as she's leaving the place that Carla was experimenting on after seeing what she had put people through, saying that she is now free, she has more time on her hands to take an assignment. End of an enemy. This is when Simmons falls from the sky, lands on a spire, his blood goes down the spire, and they make the emblem of Umbrella, which is nice. So those lights turn red, and it becomes the emblem of Umbrella. Escape from the Tower is the ending of Leon's story. Good Riddance is when they think Ushtanak is fully dead, and they drop him in the lava. The Last Weapon, which is Chris and Pierce. Chris saying, "You're still human, you're coming with me." The Bullet of Destiny is when Jake and Sherry kill Ushtanak once and for all. No More Running, this is when Jake thanks Sherry for saving him, and they get out on the fast traveling platform out of the facility. And this is when Pierce pushes Chris into the escape pod and sends him out, and the BOW tries one last attempt to stop Chris, and Pierce uses his power one last time to shoot the BOW, causing it to crash land back in the facility as it's blowing up. Trouble with Women, this is the end of Resident Evil 6 for Leon. This is when he's, going to the grave of Deborah with Helena and, continuing from there. The war isn't over. This is the last time you see Chris until Resident Evil 7. Him, still being a BSA agent, because even though he was going to give it up after the last event, Pierce, had him promise to keep going, so he did. This is when A Promise and a Goodbye. This is when Jake, says, "Oh, my blood new deal's $50 to Sherry," because he's gonna see him again. He's gonna see her again, but for now it's goodbye. And Sherry's on the plane. And then A New Purpose. This is when Jake. This is Ada's ending scene, but really it's Jake. He's going through a town that's getting infested with BOWs and mutated enemies, and there's this person who needs help, offers an apple, and he takes it and says, "Payment's done," and says, "Time to get." He starts fighting to protect these people. That is the timeline. I went through each detail as to what was happening at what time. So real quick, this is turning into a pretty much feature-length episode, to be honest, because we're already 34 minutes in, but it takes a lot to explain the whole timeline of 4 campaigns as it's progressing. Now, here's the overarching here's the overarching feeling I have about Resident Evil 6. Game is good. Game is worth it. If you are a true Resident Evil fan, you probably could go about playing it. Not saying that as a slight against the game. The game is good. I enjoy it. But the vibe and stuff that make Resident Evil what it is just isn't there. For starters, there was zero lore when it comes to being able to read stuff. if you think about it, even though it seems to a lot of people might be like, well, it stops the game vibe. Looking and finding files to pick up the read, it's just something that's always been a thing in every Resident Evil game. It's how you get backstory for what led to the current events. This game is just a whole lot of you start here, you go to B, and that's it. It's not like, why is this happening? It's like, it tells it from the perspective of four different people, yes. It tells it from Chris, Leon, Jake, and Ada in their respective campaigns, all at the same time. That's not bad. But I do miss it just because I got used to seeing files. Another thing, the differences in the different campaigns. Leon's tried to maintain that horror suspense vibe. Wasn't too bad, was sort of like 2, but it became too action packed towards the end of it. Chris was more of a Call of Duty type. You always had a squad, you always had to hunt down BOWs or monsters, and for the most part, that was just how that goes. Jake was more of the same kind of thing. It was more of like just an action adventure hero. Um, I mean, to be fair, you even fisticuff Ushtana, the giant, in the end because he's able to punch him really hard, knock him into lava. And then there's Ada, which is like not creepy. It's not that horror vibe, but it's more of an espionage type. It's more of like a a 007 kind of game where you're just someone who's going around trying to figure out like undercover agent style kind of storytelling. The different UIs weren't bad. My favorite UI was probably, I'd say, Jake's, followed by Ada, followed by Leon, followed by Chris. Um, Campaign-wise, Ada's was my favorite because it had the most so it's unfair to say it because the reason why Ada's my favorite would not make any sense without the other 3 campaigns. I won't lie. It did good to fill gaps. It was needed to fill gaps. One of the biggest issues I have with games, just in general, for the most part, is if you're gonna give me a plot hole and leave it open-ended, don't do that. You could, if you want to leave the ending of something, or you want to leave a point in the game to be like up in the air, okay, but like if you didn't have Ada's campaign, why was there a second Ada? Who was the second Ada? What's going on with Simmons? What is going on with like all this other stuff? You needed that. There are games where it doesn't give you something to explain major glaring filler issues, and like that's never good. Um, what else? So yeah, I would say it's Ada, followed by probably Leon, followed by Jake, followed by Chris, as far as the order which I like the campaigns. Um, the reason why I rank Leon's higher than probably a lot of people is because the atmosphere is at least the most there for that game compared to for that campaign compared to the other 3, as I stated earlier. Now, game mechanics, the inventory system. I both liked and hated the inventory system. Reason being, right? I'm glad ammo can stack. But why is like the assault rifle only able to stack like 40-ish, 60-ish ammo? In the other games you could stack like 200. Why? Because of the limited space. Mind you, it's limited compared to the other games. Yeah, you can say the hand grenade and the first aid spray were a separate pouch if you must. But then each green pill should also be in that other pouch. Why is the green pill taking up space in the original inventory, but you have first aid spray in a separate inventory with like the hand grenade? Like why? Why is that a thing? And why does each green pill have to take up an individual space? Is it because it's supposed to be a green herb? Fair, okay. But that's more of a reason it should be with the first aid kit, no? First aid spray. Because then you have the red pill, which you combine with a green pill to make the highest level, which is 6 green pills, which gives you 6 things of health. Fair. Having the weapons not take up a slot is pretty good. I do appreciate that. That's something that I don't think should ever have been a thing, because you could always put the weapons on your back or in a holster or something, whereas a bag should have just items. That's just from my experience with games. Now, next on the to-do list. One sec, I need a drink. Sorry, I don't usually talk this much endlessly. Whew, that's better. Now, games. Overall, you know what? No, I'll save that for the end of 9. My overall perspective. But what I will do is I'll tie stuff together. So, starting from Resident Evil 1 to Resident Evil 6. I said I was going to do this before we get to the latest trilogy, because this is going to be the most current storytelling we do. So, okay. 1. Chris and Jill get to a Shinra mansion. Most important thing about 1 is how it ends, which is them realizing Wesker's a bad guy, and Chris, Barry, Brad, Rebecca, and Jill all escape the mansion together after Wesker's supposed death. Resident Evil 2. The introduction of Leon and Claire going to the RPD, Raccoon Police Department, Raccoon City Police Department. Leon's introduction to Ada, our introduction to Ada, and them going through and finding a professor who created a vaccine for it, and yeah. The introduction of Mr. X, which is the evolved form of the Tyrant from Resident Evil 1. Tying Leon into the story itself, which is very important. They go to the facility, they deal with William Birkins, which this is also important because William Birkins is the father of Sherry Birkins, which Claire meets in Resident Evil 2. And Sherry becomes the mainstay in the series after that. So much so that she shows up in Resident Evil 6 as a major character as well. We see her grow up from being the kid who was in the orphanage with Chief Irons in Resident Evil 2, and Claire having to save her, and Leon having to go through police department that he was supposed to go to, and seeing all the people he was supposed to work with become zombies, and meeting Marvin and meeting Ada, and them all dealing with the virus in Birkins. Then Resident Evil 3, which is the next time we see Jill, where she also meets a guy named Carlos. Carlos seemed to have been a one-off, I guess? At least as of right now, because now we have Jill and Carlos. This is when Jill's going and Nemesis is chasing after her through Raccoon City. These are during the events that happened prior to 2, technically, Resident Evil 3 does, because this is where we see Marvin get bit by Brad, who was a survivor from the first game, And in 2, Leon sees Marvin, who got bit already at that point. So these, 3, I would assume those events are like the prequel slash along the same timeline as Leon's story. That ends with Jill getting infected by Nemesis, and then Carlos getting the vaccine, saving Jill, and then getting out of um, Raccoon City together, with Jill using a giant laser to finally fully kill Nemesis as they get away. 4. Let's continue Leon and Ada's story now. So, this is a continuation of 2, pretty much, sort of. Leon is heading to a village with some cops. As they're heading there, they meet these villagers who are infected, and they meet a guy named Luis, who happens to be someone who was working on the virus and then working on the antidote for the virus in Umbrella Corporation, former Umbrella employee. Umbrella is a constant throughout all the games of Resident Evil. It is the pharmaceutical company that ends up being the big bad. So, we go through that. You play as Leon first, which you go through it. You meet, because he's also here to save Ashley, which is the president's daughter. Which, if you think about it, we just got through 6 where we saw the president die. I don't know what's happened to Ashley by this point, but during 4, Leon is going to this village to try and save Ashley from a bunch of cultists. In the first chapter, we enter the village, and then he, who finds Luis, gets infected by a giant. Another giant that seems to just haunt him, which throughout the entire village. Then the second chapter, tied up to Luis. As the events go through, he meets a person who trained him named Kruger, who he fights throughout. He runs into Ada several times. He finds out about Las Plagas and what was infected to him, as well as Ashley. They run into each other again several times. They run into a castle where they fight a lord of the castle who happens to be Sadler's lackey, Ramon. Leon manages to get through him. They go to an island where he fights Kruger, and then they fight Sadler, who is the big bad of Resident Evil 4, who happens to be like a prophet who is the central hive mind, I guess you could say, of Las Plagas, which is the virus that they are trying to inject in people to make them superhuman and controllable. Then you play Ada, which is a separate storyline explaining her involvement with everything, with how her and Luis work together, and her being infected early on and being chased all over by the black shade, red-eyed cultist member that kidnapped Ashley while Ashley and Leon were in the castle. And then you just see them as they all finish off with Sadler at the very end. Because one other thing that happened during that game, Kruger killed Luis, and because of that, they both went after Sadler because Sadler needed to die anyway. And that game ended with Leon and Ashley escaping on a jet ski, and Ada escaping on a helicopter, asking Wesker what he planned to do with the virus thing when found, and Wesker's like, I'm gonna destroy the world. billions of people. Because Wesker had world domination since the very first game. Now, Resident Evil 5, which is Chris's story with Shiva. That was a interesting game because it was just very, very different from any other game we've played. We're going through Africa in that game. And during that game, people were infected with a virus that was driving them insane, transforming them. Same as most Resident Evil games, to be honest. They were traveling around, they were chasing after several people. They chased after, but the big bad of Resident Evil 5 was Wesker. Albert Wesker's back, and he's super powered. Because the event that led up to Resident Evil 5, Chris and Jill went to a mansion, and Jill got, and going through the mansion, they ran into Spencer, who ended up getting killed by Wesker. Then they fought Wesker in Spencer's room, and during the fight, Jill jumped at Wesker, saving Chris and knocking them both through a window and down to the rocky ocean floor below. Last scene from that is Chris reaching out saying, Jill! And then throughout Resident Evil 5, as they're going through Africa and fighting off more and more creatures, more and more villagers who are being transformed by this virus that's there. And this is what I meant by Resident Evil 6 being like even more different than Resident Evil 5. In Resident Evil 5, you see a lore-based file that literally explains the virus that has been present in each of the individual Resident Evil games up until that point. It ties it together. Resident Evil 6 just ties it together because of the characters being played more than actual what led up to it. Which, in a game that's based on a huge universe, kind of a little bit of a letdown. But anyway, we go through this, we fight the person, I forgot what his name was, the person who is backing the payment for the virus on a progenitor virus, the flower that you see in a garden below. Excella, who is Triforce's, Triforce. This isn't linked. Tricell, who is a healing, herb company, which apparently is also helping to develop the virus that Wesker wants, and she's working with Wesker. He betrays her and she ends up transforming as well. And then Jill and Wesker end up fighting Shiva and Chris in an underground area, crypt area, where Jill had been manipulated by an implant put on her chest. Chris and Shiva remove it, saving Jill, and then Chris, went, and Chris and Shiva ended up killing Wesker for good at the very end of Resident Evil 5. Then we went from that to Resident Evil 6, which, as you've all seen, we went through this. This is the continuation from Leon from Resident Evil 4, this is the continuation from Chris from Resident Evil 5, Ada from Resident Evil 4, and Sherry from Resident Evil 2. This brought all them characters back to have an overarching story that had to do with Simmons with the C virus. Because if you think about it, Resident Evil 5 did a decent job tying up everything from Resident Evil 1 to 5. Resident Evil 6 just felt like something they felt they had to do as like fan service, because Wesker was the big bad from 1. A lot of what Wesker wanted done is what caused the events of 2, 3, 4, and then 5 was Wesker's ultimate demise. So 6 didn't really, it was a standalone story that didn't actually pertain to the rest of the universe. Because the other thing with, in 4, it literally tells you in the opening scene of 4 with Leon about the events that transpired in 2. In 6, there isn't really any recap from anything that led to the current events. And throughout the game, there really isn't anything that even references the past events, for the most part. Yes, it mentions the virus. Yes, it mentions all that, but it doesn't really mention a whole lot. Like, the biggest tie they have is Jake Mueller is Albert Wesker's son, and Chris killed Albert Wesker. And they have little bits where they're like, oh, from Africa, and stuff like that, but if you skipped 6 and just did 1 to 5 and then jumped to 7, 8, 9, you may be able to just get away with that. Because it's just, like I said, fan service. Because, full disclosure, I don't see Jake in 7. We're not going to see Jake in 7, I'm just going to put that out there. So him being Albert's son just feels like something they felt like they should use as info for this game. A lot of the other characters will be around. But that being said, that is the timeline up until current game that we're going to play, which is 7. One last time, the beginning of the next game is going to seem a little weird because I didn't think I was going to have 5 and 6 to play prior to playing it. I recorded 1 or 2 episodes, and then I'm like, I need to put this in order on my channel. I had a couple of friends who recommended me to do that, which, you know what, made complete sense. And yeah, so there is my overall breakdown of Resident Evil 6 and the timeline from 1 to 6. Before we get into what is considered the Withers trilogy, which is 7, quote, air quotes, Biohazard. It depends on who you ask. Personally, I don't think it's called Biohazard, but you will see some places that have it like Biohazard 7, stuff like that. Village, which is 8, and then 9, which is Requiem, which I'm playing day 1, and we'll probably have half-hour episodes instead of hour episodes. But anyway, I digress. If you are having fun, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 100 subscribers by the end of the year. And as always, stay true to yourselves, take care of yourselves, and I look forward to catching you next time. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.